All right, hey, I think we're recording. Going to knock out chapter 4. I always say we're going to do it real quick, but we'll see how we do. This is a little bit of a longer one. And welcome to chapter 4. So in the first unit, we really kind of focused on all the different aspects of colonialization in the New World. We focused on the Spanish and the Dutch and the French. In chapter 4, we're going to start to refine our focus into the British colonies. And in order to understand where the American Revolution really kind of comes from, we're going to start off our journey here on the English revolutions that happened in the 1600s. Okay, so the 1700s are going to see the rise of the British Empire. By this point, by the 1700s, early 1700s, you're going to see a large, British population in the New World, living in the American colonies for different reasons. The British East India Company is going to control trade through West Africa and into Asia. They're going to be the dominant global force. And by 1750, we have over 1 million colonists and African slaves, enslaved Africans, let's call them enslaved Africans, living in the New World. Okay, and so how do we end up in this idea of revolution? Well, we talked last chapter about Henry VIII and his desire for a son. And Henry, of course, dies, and his son takes over Ed, and then Ed dies, and then his sister Mary takes over, and then Mary dies, and then Elizabeth takes over. And so Elizabeth I is going to oversee what's referred to sometimes as the golden age of the British Empire. And Parliament's going to play a pretty big role in this. During Elizabeth's reign, they're going to control public opinion. They're going to help her raise taxes, pay for wars, and really kind of keep everything in check. They keep everybody believing that they have a say in British Empire, right? Well, eventually Elizabeth is going to die, and her cousin James I is going to take over. And James I is a Stuart. It doesn't really matter. We have the Tudor, and then the Stuart. I think the Stuart family takes over. And James is a big believer in this idea of divine right, that the kings are selected by God, and their power should be unchecked. And so one of the first things James does is he dissolves parliaments. And Parliament just doesn't exist during the rest of his reign. And after he dies, Charles I takes over. And Charles needs money just needs money in general to run the government. And so he puts Parliament back in place to raise a tax on the British people. And once they do that, they demand that Charles signs what's known as the English Petition of Rights. And basically this just, it limits some of the powers of the king. So like Charles I, he signs this thing, Parliament must be approved to all tax increases. It outlaws unjust imprisonments. It outlaws the forced housing of militia or the military by civilians. It outlaws this idea of martial law. And so it limits the scope of the power of the king. And so Charles I doesn't like this, and he signs the petition. He gets his tax increase, and then he dissolves Parliament for the next 11 years. And here are some pictures of Charles. You can I think you get a pretty good idea of his personality just by looking at these pictures. I like the one on the bottom right where it has all 3 of his sides. You can always see him like talking to the artist and be like, make sure you get my good side, and they're all good. All right. So then about 11 years later, Charles tries to impose another tax. He tries to impose the Anglican religion on the people of Scotland, and Scotland revolts. And so he needs some money to fight a war, to put down this rebellion. And he calls Parliament back, and he gets his money, puts down the revolt, but he can't get rid of Parliament. He wants to get rid of Parliament. Parliament wants to stick around. And Parliament tries to execute some of Charles's advisors on ideas of treason, and Charles tries to arrest the members of Parliament. And Parliament ends up forming its own army, and they start to challenge the king for control of England. And so you have the people that support, this is called the English Civil War. The supporters of Charles are known as Cavaliers, and the supporters of Parliament are known as the Roundheads. And Parliament is going to be led by a gentleman by the name of Oliver Cromwell. And the Roundheads are going to win. They're like the common people are going to win. They're going to revolt against the king, and they're going to overthrow the king. And this is unheard of in humanity, because no one's done this. They've always just replaced kings with kings, or kings whatever. And so Charles I is captured. He's put on trial, and he's charged with being a tyrant and a traitor and a murderer and a public enemy, just all around bad person. And he's found guilty, and he's sentenced to death. And they chop his head off in front of everybody. And this just sends shockwaves through the world, because here the people of England are getting rid of their monarch. And if monarchs are really chosen by divine right, then the people of England are revolting against God, right? And so England signals that all rulers must obey the rule of law, and that no one's above the law. And there's the picture of the execution, right? And so Cromwell and Parliament, they established a democratic government known as the Commonwealth, which is the first experiment in self-rule for a long period of time, right? And they rule England kind of as a theocracy, like Puritan rules, where they outlaw cursing and Catholicism, and they outlaw illiteracy. So you have to learn how to read and write. And they close theaters and taverns, and it's just kind of a drag, right? And so Cromwell dies in 658. And the English are like, what are we doing here? Let's open up the bars. Let's go back out and see some Shakespeare. Let's do something. And so they find Charles II, who is Charles I's son, and they bring him back as king. And he's popular because he opens up the taverns, and he's pretty religiously tolerant, and he allows Catholicism and Anglicanism and Protestantism, and he doesn't really care. He just wants to be king, and he's happy, right? He remembers what happened to his dad when his dad pushed a little too hard. And so then Charles II dies, and James II takes over. And I always think James II kind of looks like Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin. And he's way less popular than Charles II. And he attempts to take power from Parliament, and people are afraid that he has Catholic leanings, and he's going to force everybody to be Catholic again. And so in 1688, so a couple of years into his reign, England reaches out to Charles II's daughter, and her name is Mary. And Mary is married to William of Orange, who is a mid-level German duke. And they ask William and Mary to come over to England and be king and queen of England. Which is a huge step up from being a mid-level duke and duchess in Germany. And so they arrive in England. They have their own private army with them. And the second they hit the English shore, Mary's father flees the country, James II. He runs over to France, and they are going to be crowned king and queen of England. However, before they do that, they have to sign what's known as the British or the English Bill of Rights. And so this lists out here on the screen the rights that are guaranteed in this Bill of Rights, where you have superiority of Congress or of Parliament over the monarch. You have Parliament must be in session regularly. The House of Commons, which is the lower house of the Parliament, which is most closely tied to the people, is given the power of the purse, and the power of the purse is the ability to spend and tax, the ability to control spending. The king can't suspend laws. They bar any Catholic from sitting on the throne. They guarantee trial by jury. They outlaw cruel and unjust punishment. And they promise this idea of habeas corpus, where you can't be put in jail for in prison without being charged with a crime. And so with this glorious revolution, which is the overthrow of James II by William and Mary, we create a limited monarchy. It doesn't create a democracy, it creates a limited monarchy, and then we're going to end up with the constitutional monarchy, basically, right? And then you know, today England is a complete democracy where the king or queen is just a figurehead. But anyways, the Constitution, the king's still very powerful, but there's limits, and so the English people in England during the late 1650s, mid 1650s to late 1650s, replaced two monarchs they didn't believe were defending their rights. And so when they did this, that is going to signal to the American colonists 100 years later that they have the same rights, because American colonists still see themselves as British subjects. So when when we get to the period after the French and Indian War, which will be chapter 5, and we start to see taxes imposed on the American colonists, them getting rid of the king and replacing them with the democracy or replacing them with something else is just a natural occurrence for them, given the background that they came up with. So, you know, during Grandpa's life, Grandpa got rid of the king, right? So why can't we do that in America as well? All right. So Charles II is still in charge. We're going to back it up just a little bit. And he establishes these restoration colonies in North Carolina, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. And so basically all of what happens here is the king is going to give large plots of land in the Americas to either trusted individuals or families or groups of people for them to redistribute the land however they see fit. And this is just to encourage settlement in the New World. We want to establish like the Carolinas. Basically, the Spanish still control Florida, and Virginia is our most prosperous colony in the New World. The English is in the New World. Virginia is the crown jewel of the American colonies, and so we want to create some kind of buffer zone between Spain and Virginia, and that's going to be North and South Carolina. Okay, the first settlers that are going to land in the Carolinas are from Barbados, and they had run sugar colonies in the Caribbean. In South Carolina, Charleston is going to be named after Charles II, and they begin to produce livestock for export, cattle and pigs. And then North Carolina, it turns out that you can get tar from pine trees, so pine tar, and that's used for waterproofing ships, and so that becomes real important. In the South Carolina colonies, rice and indigo become very, very profitable as two main sources of cash crops. And then in North Carolina, you have turpentine, tar, which we talked about, and then tobacco. And tobacco is going to become the main export of those colonies. Slavery quickly develops in North and South Carolina. One, because the original colonists come from Barbados, which was a slave colony. And two, rice is very labor intensive to grow it. Rice needs a lot of moisture and water, and mosquitoes love moisture and water. And so, excuse me, disease is going to be pretty prevalent throughout the Carolinas. And so you're going to have to replace your labor force pretty often. And that's horrible to say, but we're sitting here 400 years later, 300 and some odd years later, that people would come in and they would basically buy individuals to work them to death, and that's what they're doing there. By 1715, South Carolina has the majority of a population of slaves, and they start to pass slave laws like those that were in Barbados that really start to tie down this idea of the chattel slavery system, in which slaves and their offspring become the property of the owner. And that was de facto beforehand, but this is going to really tie it down legally, that slaves could be sold off like a sack of flour or a wagon or horses or whatever. They could be traded for the same things. So they're just property. This native population of South Carolina is going to be wiped out by diseases. And so we find that, and then the people that do survive are going to end up in debt to the British, and you're going to have a small skirmish, in which the natives are actually successful at first because of the relatively small English population of the colonies. But the colonists recruit the Cherokee tribes to side with them, and that's going to change the tide of the war. And the English are going to hold on to their land and force the Yamasee out. And so that connection between the Cherokee tribes and white culture is going to begin as early as the 1700s. And of course, we know that it's going to end poorly for the Cherokee when they get removed from the eastern part of the state through the Indian Removal Acts in 1830. But you can see that the Cherokee are the ones that are going to start to assimilate to English culture at an earlier date than most of the other Native Americans. Okay, so let's look at the New York and New Jersey colonies. England and the Netherlands, they fight a small number of wars over trade, and England is going to win. And eventually they're going to take control of the New Netherlands, which is New York, and then New Amsterdam is New York City. The English are going to take control of this. And Charles II is going to give this colony to his brother, who is James II, who is the one that's going to get run out during the Glorious Revolution. And he's James, Duke of York, and that's why we're going to rename New Amsterdam into New York, or New Netherlands into New York. And New York has a wide variety of people because the Dutch didn't have a huge population that moved there, and so they were very welcoming. We kind of talked about that in the past. And it differs from many of the others because, again, the focus is on trade. It's not on growing things. It's not on growing cash crops like tobacco or rice. It's not on, the focus isn't on religion. The focus is on trade. It got founded for the fur trade. And so then it just works on shipping and receiving. So just trade. It's given that like the fact is, like, the people of New York, or the settlers in New York, if there's a war, there's conflict, that's going to cost people money. And so New York and New Jersey is going to be places where the natives and the colonists typically get along because it's not about land. It's not about land and farming. It's about trade and making money. In addition, you have the Iroquois Nation that's in that region, and the settlers or the colonists make peace with the Iroquois for the most part. And you can watch that video and learn a little bit about the Iroquois if you so desire. Pennsylvania becomes the center of early British Empire in America. And Charles II owed a little bit of money to William Penn and his family. And so he gives William Penn a huge amount of land. And Penn is a member of a religious minority in England at this time. He's a Quaker, and the Quakers had split from the Puritans over this idea of predestination. And the Quakers believe that everybody has light in them, everybody has salvation. And when those lights are stirred, you begin to shake and quake and maybe speak in tongues. And they reject worldly rank, and they believe in social equality, and they start to use different pronouns. So they use thee and thou in place of your lordship, or dukes and duchesses and those types of things. And so that puts them in a bad place in the old world in Europe because the nobility doesn't like them. And then, like, the Puritans or the English, the religious reformers don't like them. And so the Quakers move to Pennsylvania and they set up shop. The English crown persecuted Quakers. Massachusetts had persecuted Quakers. And the Quakers believe in nonviolence, and so they don't fight back. And originally, they founded places in Barbados, but then they decided they're going to move once this is all set up. And so Pennsylvania is one of the first colonies that actually doesn't establish a colonial church. And so they believe in this idea of freedom of religion, and they promise 50 acres to anybody that will move to Pennsylvania if they complete a term of service. So a lot of poor people move to Pennsylvania as indentured servants. They work their time frame, and then they end up with some land. And so then that's going to encourage people to move there. The Quakers believe in pacifism, and so they don't believe in violence. They have a positive relationship with the Native American people. They actually buy the land from Native American tribes at a fair price. They sign peace deals to avoid war. And Pennsylvania is the only place in the colonies where there's no conflict with the natives. We talked about New York and New Jersey having less or having good relations with the natives. Pennsylvania has by far the best. Okay. Pennsylvania is also home to Philadelphia, which becomes one of the largest cities in the New World, and it's the center for trade. And we already talked about poor immigrants moving from Europe due to these open beliefs. Okay. The Quakers worked to end slavery. Pennsylvania is actually one of the first colonies to outlaw slavery. And so there we go. So the Navigation Acts, how is Britain going to control these colonies? That's probably the thing that's going to lead us to our revolution more than anything. We have to realize that the main purpose of colonies is to make money for their parent country. And so one of the things that we're going to pass is the Navigation Act. So in 1651, only English ships could carry goods between the England and the English colonies. The captain and 3/4 of the crews of ships of trade had to be English. And there's certain items that can only be shipped to England. And these are going to be the high value items because you ship them to England and then England can make money on them. So sugar, tobacco, indigo, rice, molasses, turpentine, and they're all super valuable. They're all sought after all over the world. So you can make a lot of money if you would smuggle those out of the colonies. The Staple Act, which bars colonists from importing goods that are not made in England. And then the Plantation Duties Act that places heavy taxes on goods that are traded between like Virginia and New York, or New York and Massachusetts. So sometimes you would actually get a better price if you would buy something that was made in New York, shipped to England, and then shipped back. And so that was true, but you could also smuggle stuff. So smuggling was a relatively profitable enterprise in the New World. We have the Navigation Acts of 1696, which allows the British to actually board ships they believe are smuggling stuff, which is like a blanket search warrant. And they could prosecute custom violations without juries. And so this is going to cause some problems in the New World. However, to really be honest, the British didn't really enforce any of this. Like the laws are on the books, but they have a huge like hands-off policy in which they kind of just let the American colonists do what they want. And so there's a lack of enforcement that brings about compliance to the British Crown and the American colonies. And it's not until after the French and it's not until the French and Indian War that the British Crown starts to really impose the laws and the rules that were already on the books for the American colonies. Okay, slavery is a fact of life all the way from the Massachusetts Bay colonies all the way down to South Carolina. It's more than just, the book talks about that it's more than just a labor system. It's a way for whites to put themselves at the head of society. So it's racially based. And African slavery really kind of provides this unifying factor for whites in the colonies to share some kind of social hierarchy. in Europe, you have nobility at the top, and then you have like the peasantry at the bottom. In the New World, we don't have any nobility. So you have the wealthy and you have the poor, but the wealthy and the poor are going to be white regardless of what nations they come from. But because you have an even lower status, you have these enslaved people down here that have different colored skin. These wealthy and the poor kind of form this group where they're working together to basically suppress a people underneath them. And so like, hey, at least I'm not on the bottom. In Europe, I would be on the bottom. If I'm poor in the New World, I'm in the middle. And that's good enough for a lot of people. Charles II creates this Royal African Company in which actually the King of England controls the slave trade. And his brother James II runs the company for a long period of time, in which the Royal African Company, which was the sole provider of enslaved Africans to the British colonies. And the Glorious Revolution, which dethrones James II and puts in William and Mary, brings an end to this monopoly. And after that, you actually see an increase in the number of slaves brought into the American colonies. Slaves are going to revolt. Some are going to run away. They're going to form little maroon colonies where they would live away from whites or try to get away. Probably the most famous places that's going to happen is like Jamaica, or in Jamaica, which is relatively mountainous in the middle of the islands. You have the Stono rebellion that takes place in North Carolina, in which a literate slave basically kind of poses as a preacher, and he goes around and he gathers up slaves to act out in an armed rebellion where they go around killing whites. And a local militia suppresses this rebellion. But following this, the slaves that were captured are shipped off or killed or sold to the West Indies, where they work on like sugar plantations or on rice plantations, where life is pretty awful and miserable. But because of the Stono rebellion, you start to see new slave laws get passed in places like Carolina and the rest of the world, in which you place limits on slave behavior. You limit the number of slaves that enslaved people that can be together. You prevent them from growing their own food for their own use. You prevent slaves from learning to read or write or being able to travel freely from plantation to plantation, because you want to control the information that's coming into your property and out of your property. And so you can watch a short little video there if you're interested in that. We talked about society, the fact that you have the rich people on top and the common people, poor people on the bottom, and then the enslaved people on the very bottom. So by the late 1600s, you start to see wealth develop in certain families in certain areas. And you start to see not a nobility class, but what we're going to refer to as the gentry class, or the gentry societies. And it means that you're genteel, you're free of all rudeness, you're a gentleman. And this is the idea of the Southern gentleman, where you don't work for your money. You have other people work for you. So like you're a landowner, and the land makes you your money, but you're not actually working there. And they're going to try to set themselves apart from regular society to show their wealth and privilege. And this will be important as we move into the antebellum South. So just remember, gentry society. All right, so here we go. Wars for empire. In the 1700s, war in Europe was seasonal. You would fight typically every summer. You'd have professional armies. And so like you would go out and the British would battle France for a little bit, and then maybe gain some territory, maybe you don't. And it was just kind of like a sport. It was just something fun to do. But as colonies began to grow around the world, you start to make more money. And when you start to make more money, these little wars of conquest get more serious. And so the book talks about King William's War, in which we actually have conflict between the English and the French in the New World. And then you have Queen Anne's War, or the War for Spanish Succession, which England fights France and Spain. And they fight in Spain and Florida and the New World and Canada. And this is where the pirates actually kind of get started during this time frame, but whatever, that's kind of neither here nor there. And there's a couple others, but the big one that's going to really kind of kickstart the American Revolution is going to be the French and Indian War, or in the global sense, it's called the 7 Years' War, in which the British and the French are going to fight basically a global conflict through all of their colonies in India, in the New World, between the American colonies in Canada, French Canada. They're also going to fight on the European continent. And following the British victory in this war, the British are going to have to keep a standing army in the New World, and they're going to have to pay for that. And they're going to pay for that through taxes on the American colonists. And that's what's going to kickstart the rebellion that we're going to see in chapter 5. Okay, and so this French and Indian War that's going to take place between the British and the colonists in the New World against the French settlers and the Native American tribes is going to be that first domino that's going to fall over, that's going to lead to the other dominoes that are going to ultimately lead to the American Revolution. And we'll talk about that in chapter 5. So hopefully you learned something here. Hopefully I didn't bore everybody too much. If you have any questions, always reach out to me. If not, I will see you in chapter 5 here next week. So see you.